How did Henri Bergson relate real time to free will?
Real time, according to Bergson, cannot be imagined as points on a line in space, like scientific clock time. Real time is intuited directly and within us, it is the ground of spontaneous free acts. Our free will is our spontaneous free acts, which are unpredictable. Intuition and analysis parallel this distinction. Intuition apprehends duration directly and examines it, whereas analysis breaks duration up into unchanging concepts.
How did Edmund Husserl separate mathematics and logic from psychology?
First, Husserl distinguished between numbers that are the result of counting actual objects before us and numbers as symbols. Clearly, most of mathematics deals with numbers as symbols. Husserl claimed that symbolic numbers, as well as propositions and universals, cannot be reduced to mental states, as psychologism claimed, as intentional objects of consciousness, in Franz Brentano's 1837–1917, sense of intentionality. These logical and mathematical entities are objective.
What was William Whewell's theory of induction?
In his philosophy of the inductive sciences, founded upon their history. 1840, revised, 1847, expanded, 1858, Whewell focused on discoverer's induction as used to construct phenomenal laws or generalizations, and causal laws, or explanations. This is where he described colligation as a renovation of Francis Bacon's 15611626 principles. In colligation, the mind superinduces upon facts some conception that can be used to generalize. For example, Whewell described astronomer Johannes Kepler as having colligated the points of the Martian orbit. Whewell argued that discovery occurs not as the result of new facts, but in applying the right conception to existing facts. Thus, according to Whewell, Kepler applied his ellipse conception to the facts of Mars' orbit that were already collected by the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. Whewell believed that choosing the right conception to colligate facts cannot be done by simple observation or guesswork, but requires a special process in the mind in which we infer more than we see. Once theories are created, theories can be extended to what cannot be observed, such as light waves, orbit shapes, and gravity. In other words, Whewell thought that we always approach experience with something in mind that helps us interpret experience and go beyond it.
What was Plato's metaphysical theory of forms?
Plato's major contribution to philosophy was his metaphysical theory of forms. Plato's forms were divine objects, known by the mind through thought. The practice of such thought was believed to provide the best life. The forms, like the primary substance of the pre-Socratics, were responsible for all of the things experienced by human beings and for the very existence and qualities of human beings. Animals, natural objects, and man-made objects. Indeed, the entire world of existence was held to be made up of copies of the forms. Even ideas, such as beauty, truth, and justice, had forms. Although to Plato it was viewing the mind's representations of the forms, not the actual forms themselves, that mattered. The forms were unchanging, perfect, and divine. Everything that humans could think, perceive, or imagine, and the existing objects of thoughts and perceptions, were but imperfect copies of the forms.
What are the main pre-Socratic texts?
There are no surviving texts of the pre-Socratics, and very little is known about their lives. What is known comes to us from the writings of other philosophers, beginning with Plato. c. 428 c. 348 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, their contemporaries. And especially Aristotle's student Theophrastus, 371 c. 287 BCE. For example, the writings of Heraclitus, 535 to 475 BCE, consist of fragments, and there are only 450 enduring lines from Empedocles. c. 490 to 430 BCE. Because we have no primary sources, we can't be certain how much of what is related about the pre-Socratics is skewed by the biases of their interpreters.
How did non-Euclidean geometry affect other fields?
The relationship between space and geometry changed forever in people's minds. Thanks to non-Euclidean geometry, the question arose of whether space itself was curved. This made the whole of geometry seem hypothetical and led some to question the possibility of a priori knowledge.
What was the analytic/synthetic distinction and why did C. I. Lewis need it?
Analytic truths are true by definition and tell us nothing about the world. Synthetic truths are about the world, but they can turn out to be false. Along with this distinction is the a priori/a posteriori distinction. A priori knowledge is known without, or before, experience. Whereas a posteriori knowledge can only be known after, or as a result of, experience. Empiricist philosophers traditionally hold that there are no a priori synthetic truths. and they have tended to assume that what is analytic is also a priori, and what is synthetic is a posteriori. Lewis' main philosophical tool, in accounting for both ordinary experience and scientific knowledge, was to distinguish between the a priori and what he called the given. Quite simply, he thought that our knowledge and experience was the result of the interplay between the a priori and the given. There is something brute in our experience that we have no control over. But we make sense of it by projecting a priori principles and categories onto it.
How was Newton's system received?
Newton's, 1642–1727, laws were accepted with intellectual awe, bordering on reverence. Part of this reaction was gratitude for the comprehensive way in which he plausibly united both the atomic theory and the results of the Copernican revolution. Newton was famous for his claim of not going beyond the evidence. His motto was hypotheses non fingo, or I frame no hypotheses. However, this was not literally true, given his scholium that assumed absolute space and time, and his postulation of force as action at a distance. He also assumed that God existed. But Newton's stance of empiricism, he thought, for example, that with sufficiently powerful microscopes it would be possible to see atoms someday, carried the day on the issue of whether he really was an empiricist. Newton's work was almost immediately translated into European languages and became the new view of the universe. There were also popularized versions of his ideas, and by the early 18th century idealized portraits of him were in wide circulation. Francesco Algarotti published Newton for the Ladies in 1737, which was reprinted in many editions. Because girls did not receive the same education as boys, it was widely believed that scientific knowledge had to be simplified and expressed in more gentle language for women.
What was some of the Catholic response to Martin Luther's dogmatism?
The Catholic response was to question whether Luther really had any knowledge at all and to emphasize the importance of Christian faith. Gentian Hervid published a 1569 edition of Sixtus Hypotoses, specifically as a cure for dogmatism, which would lead to serene confidence in the Church's doctrine of Jesus. Portuguese philosopher and physician Francisco Sanchez, c. 1551–1623, developed Pyrrhonic skepticism as a criticism of Aristotelianism in Quod Nihil Sitter, 1576. Although in his arguments for nominalism, combined with empirical observation, that led him to conclude that knowledge itself could not be obtained, Sanchez was closer to academic than Pyrrhonic skepticism.
What are problems with functionalism as a theory of mind?
Functionalism may result in attributing minds to complex systems that we otherwise would not consider to have minds. It might result in denying the presence of minds that operate according to different causal principles than our own. Indeed, Hilary Putnam, 1926, himself later rejected functionalism on the grounds that beliefs could not be computational states because their content was determined by external facts. And beliefs were also part of a whole system of knowledge. At the same time as Paul Kripke, 1940, and Keith Donnellan, 1931. He developed a new causal or direct theory of meaning, which was published in The Meaning of Meaning, 1975.
What was Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism?
Most professional philosophers refer to Rand's, 1905 to 1982, objectivism as a so-called philosophy. Rand claimed to have taught herself the history of Western philosophy in a matter of months, which left her a passionate follower of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. She believed that Aristotle's law of identity, or A is A, is a metaphysical principle on which can be based the existence of an objective world that is knowable through reason. Rand remains popular on many contemporary college campuses, although more for her novels and doctrine of selfishness than for her metaphysics. Most professional philosophers before and after Rand have held A is A to be a tautology, telling us nothing about the world, be it objective or otherwise.
What is Jerry Fodor's modular theory of mind?
First of all, Fodor said the mind is largely innate and mental. Development is not formed by experience, but rather set off by experience. Cognition can be described in the same way as the operations of computers, in terms of representations. The mind is modular in that many of its computational processes are independent of others. They may send their results to other computational processes without having their own processes observed by the other processes.
What is Dasein?
Dasein is Martin Heidegger's term for a human being. Its literal meaning is being there. Heidegger intended by this term to convey that human beings are not simple, self-contained biological beings, but that they are always concerned with things beyond their physical selves, with things in the world, other people, and the future.
What is deconstructionism?
Deconstructionism is a method for interpreting texts, the term for written works used by deconstructionists. That is based on the premise that the meaning of texts depends as much on the writers' background, historical conditions, and those of the reader, as it does on what is in the text itself.
Who was Hare? Hare?
Richard Mervyn Hare, 1919 to 2002, was a professor of moral philosophy at Oxford University. And he later taught at the University of Florida. In his The Language of Morals, 1992, he argued for the prescriptive nature of moral judgments and their universalizability, or ability to be generalized. In Freedom and Reason, 1963, and Moral Thinking, Its Levels, Method, and Point, 1981. Hare held that ethical concepts are used according to logical rules that support the truth of utilitarianism. The utilitarianism propounded by Hare was two-tier, providing for both act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism requires that we do singular actions that will result in the best consequences, whereas rule utilitarianism requires that we follow rules that will result in the best consequences.
What did George Berkeley think of matter, extension, and other mainstays secured by René Descartes and refined by John Locke?
According to Berkeley, matter and extension. The main property of matter that was supposed to be its occupation of space, were abstract, general ideas. Which is to say that the words naming or describing them did not refer to real ideas. Since only ideas, minds, and God exist, matter and extension did not exist for Berkeley. There was nothing real corresponding to them. Berkeley applied the same criticism to our presumptive ideas of causation and the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. He looked for the ideas of sense or imagination to back them up, and found none. In the case of causation, Berkeley was basically an occasionalist.
What are some facts about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's life and career?
Merleau-Ponty's father was killed in World War I. He completed his philosophical studies at the École Normale Supérieure in 1930 and then taught in high schools throughout France. He wrote 2 dissertations for his doctorate and was given the chair of child psychology at the Sorbonne in 1949. Next, he was made chair of philosophy at the Collège de France in 1952. With Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, he founded the journal Les Temps Modernes. But he resigned from the publication as editor, partly in objection to Sartre's subject-object dichotomy. Merleau-Ponty wrote about their dispute in Adventures of the Dialectic, 1955. Overall, Merleau-Ponty opposed dualisms and he also criticized self versus world ideas. He thought that the self was as much a body as a mind and that our bodies are always in the world.
What were William James' theories concerning religion and free will?
James thought that whether or not to believe in God, or to believe that we have free will, and that there are objective values, cannot be decided neutrally by an appeal to facts. The facts in such matters are inconclusive, and a neutral intellectual position does not address the importance to us of whether or not God exists, or if we have free will, or whether there are objective values. Because our beliefs in such matters will make a difference in our lives and those of others. We must will to believe that God exists, that we have free will, and that there are objective values. In the case of free will, to motivate ourselves toward actions that are unpleasant. We should think about their positive consequences. James offered an example of this, when one is reluctant to arise from bed on a cold morning. If one thinks about what one will do that day, the necessary physical motion becomes almost automatic.
What was Anaxagoras' idea about the mind?
Anaxagoras of Klazoini, c. 500 to 428 BCE, believed that the first cause of motion was mind, which is separate from everything else. Mind created the things in the world by starting a vortex in which different kinds of matter separated out.
What is Fodor's language of thought hypothesis?
The language of thought and thinking, as a mental language, is a system of symbols in the brain. Its content are propositional attitudes such as, thinks that, desires that, intends that, believes that, hopes that, and so forth. Each attitude has a distinct computational relation to a representation. Computation is information processing based on syntax. As Fodor puts it, there is no computation without representation. Thus, having a belief is being in a computational relation to a representation, as is having a desire. Every primitive concept in thought has a neural symbol in the brain. The end result of this in behavior is that the representation that is a belief causes an individual to behave as if it were true. Whereas the representation that is a desire causes the individual to behave to make it true.
Who were some important women philosophers from antiquity?
Although they probably are but the tip of an iceberg, Themistocles, Theano of Crotona, Diotima of Mantinea, Aspasia of Miletus, Isara of Lucania, Fintus of Sparta, Perictian I, Theano II, Hypatia of Alexandria, Aspigenia of Athens, and Arete of Cyrene deserve specific mention.
What did Alfred North Whitehead think the world was composed of in reality?
According to Whitehead, the most primitive real unit is an actual occasion, which is not anything or substance that persists in time, but a process of becoming. This process of becoming is related to every other process of becoming, or as Whitehead's commentators have explained, the basic unit of reality is a Leibnizian monad that has windows on every conceivable surface. The entire world is organic and nature is a structure of evolving processes. Reality is process. Moreover, Whitehead believed that his ontology, unlike the scientific ontology of inert objects, allowed for the existence of an evolving God.
What has been important in second-wave feminist political philosophy?
The concept of patriarchy, or rule by fathers, throughout human history sparked much social and textual analysis, which was brought to theoretical completion by Carol Pateman in The Sexual Contract, 1988. Pateman argued that when modern social contract theory was constructed by Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, women were left out of the political equation and relegated to private life. Iris Young, 1949 to 2006, a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, addressed the connection between female social roles and political structures in Justice and the Politics of Difference, 1990, and Inclusion and Democracy, 2000. Young also addressed women's disempowered bodily comportment in her 1980 essay Throwing Like a Girl, included in a book by the same name in 1990. In addition, feminist philosophers have welcomed and discussed the work of University of Michigan Law School professor Catherine McKinnon.
How do philosophers deal with ethical relativism?
Philosophers intensely dislike prescriptive ethical relativism. It makes the analysis of moral terms and the construction of moral systems pointless because there is no way to justify them. Different positions have been taken about descriptive moral relativism. Some philosophers deny it, claiming that once we understand moral systems that seem to be different from our own, we can derive universal moral principles from all moral systems that apply to all human beings. Others have argued that even though there are different viewpoints about what is morally right, some of those viewpoints are simply wrong, and then their job is to show how they are wrong.
Who was Margaret Fuller?
Margaret Fuller, 1810 to 1850, organized weekly Saturday conversations with women in Boston to supplement their education and discuss their condition in society. She co-founded the Dial with Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882, in 1840, which was the official transcendentalist publication for 4 years. Fuller left the magazine in 1842 to write for the New York Tribune. Fuller interviewed intellectuals for the Tribune in England and Italy in 1846, including George Sand, Thomas Carlyle, and the Italian revolutionary Giovanni Asoli, with whom she fell in love. The couple had a child and married. The entire family drowned in a sea accident while returning to the United States. When their ship hit a sandbar 100 yards away from Fire Island. Fuller's main work is Woman in the 19th Century, 1845, in which she argued for women's independence and equality between the sexes. Her great-nephew was the 20th century architect of geodesic domes, Buckminster Fuller.
What was medieval philosophy?
Medieval philosophy was the historical period of thought from the 4th through the 14th centuries, which was dominated by religious concerns, the study of ancient Greek philosophy, and a need to reconcile rational inquiry with religious faith. It was mainly, but not completely, limited to the implications of Christian doctrine. Thus, Saint Augustine, 354–430, in the 4th century gave Christianity its first philosophical foundation in politics and ethics. And at the end of the era Nicholas of Orsma, 1323–1382. In working out Aristotelian theories of motion that were approved by the Church, he was able to anticipate infinitesimal calculus and coordinate geometry, before Galileo's mechanical theories.
What was Jean-Paul Sartre's basis for his idea of freedom?
Sartre argued that freedom was inherent in the very structure of human consciousness. To be conscious is to be free. Consciousness has no prior cause but is a spontaneous upsurge. Consciousness is nothing in itself, because it is always aware of something other than itself. Consciousness is freedom. Thus, consciousness is not a thing in itself. Sartre called consciousness the for itself, or pour soi, and everything else is the in itself, or en soi. At first glance, his division of the human cosmos into for itself and in itself resembles René Descartes, 1596–1650, doctrine of mental and physical substance. But Sartre went beyond Descartes' idea of the mental substance. For Sartre, as his hero in Nausea, 1938, discovers in the course of a research project, even a person's past meritorious acts or traits of character have the status of en soi. It is a form of bad faith. For example, to pretend that one is determined to fulfill his or her duty because that is how he or she was raised. or that one's laziness makes disciplined work impossible. People are responsible for allowing their own background, weaknesses, or strengths to be motives for action in the immediate present.
What advances were made during the 19th century concerning the philosophy of mathematics and logic?
During the 19th century, a logical theory of probability was propounded. Non-Euclidean geometry was discovered, the objectivity and necessary truth of scientific first principles were questioned. A new system of logical notation was devised. And the possibility that mathematics could be reduced to logic was introduced.
To whom is Berkeley's idealism perplexing?
To those who continue to cleave to the reality of the perceived existence of an external world. Berkeley's idealism can be perplexing. It is also a problematic position for many scientists, who must believe in an objective reality in order for their work concerning objective facts to make sense.
How was Simone de Beauvoir influential as a feminist?
Writing at a time when women did not have a recognized voice in public life, they had only received the right to vote in 1944 in France or opportunities to pursue professions. Beauvoir offered a comprehensive account and analysis of the position of women in Western society with a focus on their life stages. For women, unlike men, biology is destiny, she said. She was not particularly sympathetic to the subordinate condition of women. Generally, because she thought that they too easily accepted their secondary passive roles in comparison to the leading active roles allowed and expected of men. Beauvoir did not clearly indicate ways in which women could realize their human freedoms and transcend their object-like status, or immanence, as human beings who were not only objectified by men, but who seemed too content to objectify themselves. However, she began a trend in social and political activism, as well as intellectual life, which recognized and addressed the ways in which women were the second sex.
What is the origin of materialism, Marxism, and anarchism in the modern era?
Intellectually, they were all reactions against Hegelianism. In society, as political movements, they represented a natural historical progression from the French Revolution, and a reaction against the Industrial Revolution in Europe, as well as against feudalism in Russia.
Who were some female Pythagoreans?
Pythagoras' wife, Theano of Crotona, Italy, c. 546 BCE, and their 3 daughters were members of Pythagoras' first group of followers. Theano was said to have discussed metaphysics and written about marriage, sex, women, and ethics. After Pythagoras died, Theano and her 3 sons succeeded him as leaders of the Pythagorean school. Theano II, her birth and death dates are uncertain except that she was not Theano I. A later Pythagorean, addressed moral contextualism, or the theory that what is right to do should take particular circumstances into account. She also believed that harmony, is, or should be, the foundation of morality and education. Some historians believe that Paraction I, late 4th to 3rd centuries BCE. Another Pythagorean, said to have written on the harmony of women, was Plato's mother.
Who was Leo Strauss?
Leo Strauss, 1899 to 1973, is important for his work relating philosophical texts to politics in real life. He was a German-born American philosopher who left a position at the Academy of Jewish Research in Berlin, Germany, to study in Paris, France, on a Rockefeller Fellowship in 1932. Because, as a Jew, it was unsafe for him to return to Germany when the Nazis came to power. He taught at Cambridge University and in New York, until he became professor of political science at the University of Chicago in 1949. Remaining there until 1969. Strauss taught classical political philosophy. His work became inspirational to American neoconservatives after his death. His students and purported followers in real-world politics during the administration of President George W. Bush included Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and Abram Schulsky, who headed the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans. The political writer William Crystal was also a student. But so were the liberal social critic Susan Sontag and the apolitical literary critic Alan Bloom. Strauss' principal publications include The Political Philosophy of Hobbes, 1935, reprinted, 1952, Persecution and the Art of Writing, 1952, Natural Right and History, 1953, Thoughts on Machiavelli, 1958, The City and Man, 1964. Political Philosophy, 6 essays by Leo Strauss, 1975, and Socrates and Aristophanes, 1980.
Is French feminism flamboyant?
At times, yes, it is. For example, Baronin Andermatt Conley relates that Helensixus, 1937, used to enter the complex of the University of Paris at Vincennes in a dazzling ermine coat, whose capital worth most probably surpassed the means of many in the classroom.
What are some results of experimental philosophy?
Thus far, Bertrand Russell's 1872–1970 theory of descriptions has failed. At least one intuitive test. Respondents are inclined to blame people for what they do unintentionally, which, according to philosophers, they should not. Free will is also held to be compatible with determinism, which philosophers have assumed not to be the case.
What do we know for sure about Plato's life?
Although Plato, 427–347 B.C., is perhaps the most influential and highly revered philosopher in the Western tradition, and thousands of philosophical careers have been based on his ideas, little is known about his life, with certainty. This is partly because there was a convention in Plato's time that philosophers writing about their contemporaries not mention them by name. Nevertheless, there is agreement on some broad facts about Plato's life. Plato, for instance, was present at Socrates' trial and began his own philosophical works about 15 or 20 years later. Plato was the scion of a politically well-placed, rich aristocratic family who were anti-democrats. At first, Plato envisioned a political career for himself. But after the Democrats gained power and Socrates was sentenced to death, he prudently avoided politics. Plato served in military campaigns in the war against Sparta and was probably in the cavalry. In the 380s BCE, he traveled to Egypt and Syracuse in Sicily. Plato went to Syracuse 3 times as guest of the tyrant Dionysius the Elder, and then of his son Dionysius the Younger. Both father and son were thought to be interested in Plato's ideas about government. But the results of Plato's involvement in Sicilian statecraft are usually referred to as disastrous. Plato never married, and when he died at the age of 81 he was relatively poor.
How did Edmund Husserl distinguish between two types of the self?
First, Husserl explained that there is the psychological ego or the self that owns or makes the intentional acts of consciousness. The psychological ego exists in the world, because one can be aware of it as a self. But there is also the transcendental ego for which there is a world and which is concerned about truth. The transcendental ego intends the world. The transcendental ego makes it possible for the psychological ego to exist, and it determines how it will function.
How did John Stuart Mill criticize William Whewell's view of moral intuitionism?
Mill's criticism of Whewell's moral intuitionism was that it implied that morality could not progress because necessary truths are always true. Mill further claimed that Whewell's necessary moral truths would preserve the status quo. and he charged Whewell with conservatively supporting slavery, marriage without women's consent, and cruelty to animals. What Mill missed, however, was that, as with fundamental ideas in science, Whewell held that we may not know all of the relevant rules of morality. Thus, discovering these rules allowed for moral progress.
What were Leo Strauss' main politically relevant ideas?
Strauss, 1899 to 1973, was mainly a classical political theorist. He believed that an important connection between real-life politics and philosophy began with Socrates, 460 to 399 b. CE, Trial and Conviction. He argued that, since Socrates' philosophers had hidden their meanings to escape political persecution, Strauss developed a theory of reading as a way for independent thinkers to uncover the true intentions behind necessarily obscure texts. Strauss did not believe that the social science distinction between facts and values was fundamental. This distinction held that statements about what should be the case cannot be logically deduced from statements about what is the case. He held that politics could not be studied without prior values. Strauss thought that human excellence and political virtue had been neglected as a result of the importance placed on individual freedom in modern liberalism. Because liberalism as a doctrine led to relativism, it could be subject to two kinds of nihilism, a brutal nihilism, as in Nazi Germany or Communist Russia, which erased existing foundations of society to enshrine new ideals, or a gentle nihilism that led to permissive egalitarianism, as in American culture. Strauss apparently endorsed noble lies as a political means for correcting contemporary abuses. According to new political philosophy based on the esoteric readings of classical texts, a noble lie is a lie told to people who will benefit from believing it. However, he himself had no clear solutions to tensions between reason and religion, or modern versus ancient political philosophy.
Who was Jacques Derrida?
The Algerian-born French intellectual theorist, Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004, is widely considered to be the founder of deconstructionism, which he presented in his introduction to a 1962 translation of Edmund Husserl's, 1859 to 1938, The Origin of Geometry. In a later interview, Derrida said of this work, using his distinctive terminology that has made so many Anglo-American philosophers dismissive of deconstruction, in this essay the problematic of writing was already in place as such, bound to the irreducible structure of deferral in its relationships to consciousness, presence, science, history, and the history of science, the disappearance or delay of the origin, etc. This essay can be read as the other side, recto or verso, as you wish, of speech and phenomena. Using Husserl's standard that for something to be known it must be known by human consciousness. Derrida developed a critique of the metaphysics of presence. The tradition that imagined knowledge as a thing known to God or the absolute consciousness. He called the whole history of Western philosophy a search for a transcendental being that serves as the origin or guarantor of meaning. His principal books include Speech and Phenomena and other essays on Husserl's theory of signs. 1973, Of Grammatology, 1976, Writing and Difference, 1978, Spurs, Nietzsche Styles, 1979. The Archaeology of the Frivolous, Reading Kondelik, 1980, Margins of Philosophy, 1982. The Postcard, From Socrates to Freud and Beyond, 1987, Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry. An Introduction, 1962, 1989, Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question, 1989, and The Gift of Death, 1995. Derrida is most famous for Of Grammatology, 1972.
Who was Charles Hartshorne?
Charles Hartshorne, 1897 to 2000. Wrote over 20 books dedicated to developing the theological side of Whitehead's philosophy. Hartshorne posited a dynamic form of evolution that included human events, time, history, and God. God is dipolar. He has an abstract pole and a concrete one. Hartshorne thought that the necessity of God's existence could be proved in his version of St. Anselm of Canterbury's ontological argument. Hartshorne believed that Anselm was mistaken in attempting to prove the existence of God from thought, but that what can be proved is the necessity of God's existence. Hartshorne's major works are Beyond Humanism, Essays in the New Philosophy of Nature, 1968. The Logic of Perfection and Other Essays in Neoclassical Metaphysics, 1962, revised, 1973, Anselm's Discovery, 1965. A Natural Theology for Our Time, 1967, revised, 1992, The Philosophy and Psychology of Sensation, 1968. Creative Synthesis and Philosophic Method, 1970, Reality as Social Process, 1971, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. 1984, and Born to Sing, An Interpretation and World Survey of Birdsong, 1992.
What did Henry Sidgwick contribute to moral theory?
First, Sidgwick is considered to have offered the clearest exposition of the classic utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham, 1748-1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806-1873, to such an extent that he is often counted as a utilitarian himself. But second, it is his comparative assessment of egoism, utilitarianism, and intuitionism that remains most instructive. Egoism is the moral system according to which we should always act in our own self-interest. Sidgwick examined both common-sense moral principles and the main claims of all three systems and concluded that none is self-evident or certain according to intuition. He thought that utilitarianism could be useful when we do not know what to do and seek guidance, but that the basic principles of utilitarianism depend on intuition for their acceptance. But egoism also seems self-evident, and it often conflicts with utilitarianism. Sidgwick admitted that he could not resolve this contradiction.
What do Deleuze and Guattari mean by their bizarre terminology?
Gilles Deleuze, 1925–1995, and Pierre-Félix Guattari, 1930–1992, took pride in using new terms that they did not define, but which they thought readers would understand. Mutant universes of value seems to refer to new systems of value that are unconventional and popular. Examples in our time would be interests in vampires in entertainment, the growing importance of electronic communication, and the change in household pets from mere pets to members of the families with whom they live. The importance of town hall meetings in the United States would be an example of micropolitics. Schizoanalysis, which suggests contradictory meanings, was used to refer to Deleuze and Guattari's project of getting rid of the idea of the Freudian idea of the unconscious as a way of explaining human behavior. Becoming woman refers to the fact that contemporary women are actively involved in defining their own social roles.
Why was Thomas Reid important?
Thomas Reid, 1710–1796, was the founder of Scottish common sense philosophy, which was prominent in English thought during the first half of the 19th century, and was revived by G. E. Moore, 1873–1958, in his attack on idealism in the 20th century. Reid's basic contribution was a criticism of the doctrine of ideas in philosophy, which in his own time was famously deployed by David Hume, 1711–1776. Although it had strong predecessors in John Locke, 1632–1704, and George Berkeley, 1685–1783. Reid believed that it is impossible that what we know are sensations or ideas in the mind, because this can't account for the immediacy of our experience of objects present to the senses. Motion, or our experience of our own selves. Reid thought that we directly know real objects in the world, just like we assume in common sense. For example, when you look at a computer screen as you type, you do not perceive the idea of the screen, but rather the screen itself. His common sense was to insist on the location of the knower directly in the world, with no mediation in the mind by ideas, sensations, or impressions.
What were Leibniz's views on embryology?
Gottfried Leibniz believed in preformationism. The theory that all living things had been created at once so that their offspring unfold from completely formed seeds, or homunculi in the case of humans and animunculi for animals. Some preformationists believed that the whole of successive humanity must have been present in Adam's testicles from the time he was in the Garden of Eden, while others held that they were in Eve's ovaries. These two views were called spermism and ovism, respectively. The opposing theory to preformationism was epigenesis, or the idea that embryos developed in time. However, before a true knowledge of heredity or conception. Together with Christian belief that mere matter could not by itself become a complex living organism. Epigenesis did not seem plausible given available evidence. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a highly skilled Dutch lens grinder, was able to construct microscopes that magnified items 200 times. Around 1700, after having seen bacteria, he reported viewing both male and female sperm. I have often observed the sperm of a healthy man without waiting for it to become corrupt or fluid/watery, 5 or 6 minutes after ejaculation. I have noticed a large number of small animals. I think it must be more than 1,000, on an area no larger than a grain of sand. Leeuwenhoek reported having seen tiny animals with completely formed features in pond scum and tooth plaque, as well as in the sperm of over 30 animals. He was made a member of the Royal Society, and his descriptions of miniature worlds within worlds were accepted as evidence for preformationism, as well as the original creation of everything in the universe, all at once, by God.
What were Herbert Spencer's ideas about evolution?
Spencer believed that change occurs according to the law of evolution, which dictates a progression from simplicity to homogeneity to uniformity to more complexity to heterogeneity to variety. At any stage, all of the parts that are changing are also part of one whole. Spencer cited as evidence examples from the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences. Society itself evolves from primitive homogeneous forms to complex advanced ones. He pointed out, whereby component parts have different functions. Because Spencer thought that change follows its own internal rules. He believed that social progress cannot be the result of external actions, such as social welfare or the regulation of trade. In education, he believed that children should be taught skills that would best enable them to compete with others. Spencer's views were taken up by social Darwinists, who advocated the principles of the survival of the fittest for society, against social reform generally, and in favor of capitalistic competition, specifically.
How did other philosophers and scientists react to Pierre Gassendi's views?
Jean de Sillon, 1600–1667, and René Descartes, 1596–1650. Tried to develop positive knowledge claims that would avoid Gassendi's skepticism. Sillon argued that knowledge was possible because it existed in logic and the sciences. Descartes based his entire philosophy on an attempt to demonstrate the existence of certain scientific knowledge that would not conflict with church doctrine. In the end, the Jesuits upheld Gassendi's view that certainty is impossible and condemned Descartes.
Who was the Marquis de Sade?
Dinatien Alphonse François de Sade, 1740–1814, was a French nobleman and revolutionary best known for his shocking pornographic works Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue, Juliet, Vice Richly Rewarded, 120 Days of Sodom, The School of Licentiousness, Incest, and the Crimes of Love. In an age that was not strongly focused on vice and sin, he managed to spend over 30 years of his life incarcerated in an insane asylum, as well as in prison mostly on account of his writing. The term sadism is based on his name.
Who was Émile Durkheim?
Émile Durkheim, 1858–1917, taught at the universities in Bordeaux and Paris, and is credited with having founded the academic field of sociology in France. His goal was to develop sociology as a positive science with its own subject matter. His major contribution in this regard was an insistence that society could not be reduced to the nature and behavior of the human individuals that constituted it. His principal works were The Division of Labor in Society, 1893, The Rules of Sociological Method, 1895, Suicide, 1897, and The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, 1912.
How did medicine progress after Hippocrates?
Galen of Pergamum, c. 129 c. 216 CE, preserved Hippocratic medicine, which continued largely unchanged through the Renaissance. Galen was able to increase knowledge of physiology by dissecting pigs and apes. Since human dissection was against Roman law, he learned how to treat trauma and wounds while working as a physician in a gladiator school. Galen performed many operations, including brain and eye surgery. The removal of cataracts, which were not attempted again for almost 2,000 years. He eventually became a physician to Marcus Aurelius, 121–180 CE. In the 9th century, Galen's writings were translated into Arabic by Hunan ibn Ishaq, 809–873. However, the Arabs rarely practiced surgery, and among Christians, The knowledge and practice of surgery had already been abolished. Galen remains so highly regarded that when dissections during the Renaissance appeared to contradict his descriptions, they were considered anomalous. His prescription of bloodletting for almost every illness was followed as late as the 19th century.
What was evolutionary thought like in America during the 19th century?
Within educated communities, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was broadly accepted as an accurate history of living beings. Since deism, or the idea that God was suffused throughout nature, was a widespread perspective at the time, there was not an obvious conflict between religious accounts of creation and evolution. Discussion more commonly centered on whether social forms of evolution were ruthlessly competitive or cooperative. As in 19th century European thought, there were two perspectives: life in society, as in nature, was red in tooth and claw and a matter of survival of the fittest. Or, life in society, as in nature, evolved through cooperation. It is not surprising that the transcendentalists favored the cooperative view.
What is analytic philosophy?
Analysis is a mental process that breaks down ideas, beliefs, arguments or trains of thought, and systems of thought into their simpler components. Insofar as philosophy is about mental products in its own field and others, all philosophy is analytic. However, in American philosophy departments, and internationally, the term analytic philosophy has come to designate 20th century mainstream philosophical thinking, as opposed to continental philosophy, pragmatism, and subjects that now fall under new philosophy because they are recent additions to the field.
What were Voltaire's religious views?
Voltaire rejected the wager of the brilliant 17th-century mathematician Blaise Pascal, 1623–1662. The following passage from Pascal's Pensées constitutes the famous wager: God is, or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide. Nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn. Up. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will. Your knowledge and your happiness, and your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other. Since you must of necessity choose. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. If you gain all, if you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation that he is. In other words, if we don't know whether God exists, we have two choices. We can base our life on the premise that he is. In that case, if he exists, we will go to heaven. But suppose he doesn't exist? It's still better to bet that he is, because if he isn't, we lose nothing. Whereas, if we bet that he isn't and he isn't, we are merely confirmed in our misery, but if he turns out to exist, we go to hell when we die. Voltaire would have none of this. Voltaire believed that the Dasein evident in nature was proof of God's existence, as first cause, prime mover, and supreme intelligence. How can a benevolent and omnipotent God permit evil to exist? Voltaire was very distressed by the Lisbon earthquake and tidal wave that struck on All Saints' Day in 1755, killing thousands. In his poem Sur le Désastre de Lisbonne, 1755, he rejected both Leibnizian optimism and the doctrine of original sin. He concluded that all humans can do is accept such evil and continue to worship. In Tzaddik and other writings his sense of religious awe was further stressed. He maintained an attitude of tolerance for the rest of his life, with ongoing interests in the teachings of Confucius and the Quakers. In his final years, Voltaire overtly attacked the Catholic Church for its intolerance. He proclaimed, "Those who can make you believe absurdities, can make you commit atrocities."